Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us is Scott Melker, crypto trader and investor and host of the Wolf of All Streets podcast and author of the Wolf Den newsletter to discuss what's next for crypto following the FTX fallout scam, whatever you'd like to call it, Scott. And it seems as if this is the only thing going on in the crypto space right now. So what are your thoughts? What are you hearing from investors and traders? Do we take the loss and move on? Have we learned anything here?
I think they're definitely moving on, and hopefully we've learned things, although I don't have as much faith in humanity as others do. I think that we will likely repeat the same mistakes in the next cycle when everyone's a genius in a bull market and prices start to go up again. I'm still cautious about the continued contagion. Of course, we've already seen Genesis having their issues, which has led some issues for Gemini on their Earn product, which is powered by Genesis. I think there's just a very incestuous relationship between all of the companies in this industry because it's so small that it's hard to predict how far this is going to continue. But I do think that we've heard the biggest stories so far, and we're still looking at a process of bottoming here.
So what are you supposed to do if you're holding crypto? Is there any exchange that you can trust? I mean, there's a number of them out there, but to your point, it seems as if the contagion effect is real because it is such an incestuous industry.
I mean, Americans have very few options in the first place at this point, to be honest. Of course, there's Kraken, Coinbase, Gemini, and Binance US. The others have largely, sort of disappeared or become too small to be relevant. I would say that if you had to choose, Coinbase is a publicly traded company. They don't really participate in lending. They're, backed one for one with customer assets. I think that's relatively trustworthy and probably the one that you would choose. I'm not even a Coinbase user, to be quite frank, but I do think that is the fact. But at the end of the day, I think you and I talked about this before, but this has led to a nice push to self-custody, which is the original ethos of Bitcoin in the first place. We're seeing massive increases in hardware wallet sales and people moving their coins off of exchanges. And I do think that is a positive trend because that's what this is all about in the first place. But honestly, I think that you should have most of your coins off of exchanges right now while the dust settles.
So let's talk about technicals for a moment here. What are your thoughts in terms of Bitcoin? Where do we go?
Right now, it's hard to get particularly excited. I can see both sides of the argument, to be quite honest. See, I thought we were bottoming already, and then the FTX scam fallout, as you mentioned, happened, and we sort of broke through that $17,500 floor. We were basically ranging from $17,500 to $22,000 and pushing towards the top of that range. Now, I would say that if you're looking at it technically, that 17,500 June low now is resistance, right? So anything under that, hard to get excited. I would say that the trend continues to be more bearish below that number. If we can see price flip above that and get back into that other range, we can start to be a bit encouraged. I do think even though we've seen this sort of separation, correlation from the stock market and other assets, that it still largely does depend on what happens with the Fed. So if the Fed does sort of slow their tightening and eventually pivot, I do think that Bitcoin will see the benefits and disproportionately to the upside than other asset classes.
Yeah, well, Scott, it's interesting because the traditional asset class managers and strategists that I speak with, you're all saying the same thing, right? We know 2022 is kind of going to hum and hoe along there. 2023, there's a lot of negative expectations out there for the first half, but then once the macro starts to find its way and things start to settle out, we're kind of hearing the same thing. It sounds as if it's still coupled to what's happening in the macro.
Yeah, I think that's true. And listen, I think most of the bad news in both macro and Bitcoin should be behind us, or at least priced in at this point, right? And so I think that even if we hit a pretty serious and long recession, that doesn't necessarily mean that stocks will have to follow, because if we have a recession, we might get that Fed pivot and start to see a bit of easing and a bit more money printing. So barring any major black swan events, I think that Bitcoin will largely be up or down along with other assets, but that it will be up or down more depending on what happens, right? It's kind of a higher beta asset. We've talked about before the fact that in March of 2020, Bitcoin bottomed under 4,000, stock market bottomed with COVID. Well, Bitcoin went up 16, 17 times while the stock market doubled. So I would assume that if we do get a recovery, that Bitcoin and crypto will be an asset that massively outperforms.
Yeah, and this is such a hard question to ask because no one has a crystal ball. Do you think we're kind of over the hump when it comes to FTX? I can't imagine anything a bigger black swan happening than what we saw with FTX.
It would be hard to imagine a bigger black swan, to be quite frank. So even though FTX wasn't necessarily the biggest, it was the third largest exchange. But Sam Bankman-Fried was the biggest personality in the crypto space. And he was the very person that was talking to legislators and regulators and sort of speaking on behalf of the industry. So even if a company that's quote unquote bigger fails, I don't think it would be a bigger event than having it happen with Sam Bankman-Fried. A Binance failure or a Coinbase failure are the only like black swan events at that level that I could imagine. And I really don't see either of those things happening anytime in the near future. I really do think that we've processed most of the bad news here, probably just chopped sideways with a lot of negativity and maybe even eventually indifference towards the industry before we start heading back up eventually. But we will once again have another bull market. It's guaranteed. It's just the way that humans work and the way that cycles happen.
Excellent point, Scott. Appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.